Welcome to another installment of our virtual Lunch and Learns here in the Howard County Office of Human Rights and Equity, where we are talking about intersectionality. And I am so excited about today's guest, and I will introduce her to you in just a few moments. But here in the Office of Human Rights and Equity, we just want to remind you that we are here to serve you. And so if you ever experience discrimination, we want to encourage you to reach out to us at OHRE at howardcountymd.gov. We want to make sure that you know and understand that your race, your religion, your creed, your national origin, your language, all of these things are protected classes. And so if you ever experience discrimination here in Howard County, whether it be while you're working, while you're playing, while you're studying, or while you're worshiping, then we want to make sure that you reach out to us so that we can work with you to mediate and settle that discrimination claim. We also here do a variety of community outreach initiatives. And so right now we are in Native American Heritage Month, and we had an amazing Native American Heritage celebration. And our speaker this afternoon was actually present. She was one of the dancers. And so we were just so grateful to be able to partner with County Executive Calvin Ball, along with the Howard County Library System, to put on just a spectacular event that featured authors and storytellers and powwow dancers and Navajo tacos and just a variety of other Native American cultural expressions. And we know that you had an awesome time there. But we also are excited that on Thursday, November the 18th, we're also going to be having our Native American book discussion group. And so while you're watching this, this event would have happened already. And so we've got so many of you already registered for that, over 30 of you registered for that discussion. And so we are so excited about the discussion that will happen then. But today we are going to be delving into the history and the experience of the intersectionality of those who identify as both African American and Native American. And I am so grateful and excited about today's guest. We have none other than Karelle Hall. She is a PhD candidate in anthropology at Rutgers University. She received her bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College in anthropology with a minor in Native American studies. Her dissertation research explores embodied and distributed Lenape diasporic sovereignty in public and performative spaces. She has taught classes in both cultural and linguistic anthropology at Rutgers University and has presented her preliminary research at conferences and colloquiums. As a member of the Nanakoke Indian tribe, she has represented her nation at numerous events as both a speaker and dancer. She is actively working on Nanticoke language revitalization, including the writing of a children's book and developing lessons for community classes. Using her experience and connections in the legal field, she assisted the Natickok tribe with ratifying their recognition in the state of Delaware. She continues to work as an activist and representative for her community, promoting visibility, decolonization, and education. So Howard County, the Office of Human Rights and Equity, is so excited to present to many and introduce to some none other than Karelle Hall. Karelle, thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to hearing what you have to present to us.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about my own identity, as well as placing it in some historical context. So I am a Black woman, and I am a Native American woman. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that story. So first, I'm going to just give you a PowerPoint presentation to discuss some of the historical aspects. So being Black and Native can often be an uncomfortable identity in this country. You receive a lot of pressure to more strongly identify with one side or the other. And that one drop rule still often applies socially. So there's this idea that if you have any amount of Black ancestry, you cannot or should not claim any Native American identity. And in addition to this, many Black Americans, as they are tracing their own identities and histories and lineages, um, often are looking for and find Native American heritage. Oftentimes, this is based on oral histories that are passed from their family members and their relatives. And part of this work is to reclaim some of that identity and these different parts of their heritage that were violently stripped from them and continue to be erased from them. But so many of these individuals, they identify primarily as Black, and they're looking to understand some of their historical identities, and so they don't have any direct connections to any Native American communities today, and they don't have tribal membership. And this history is further compounded by this problem of the historical record itself and being very, inaccurate and scattered and difficult for many members of this country who are not white to be able to trace these documents due to that, indifference of the government to keep accurate records for their non-white citizens. So for me, my dual identity involves the fact that I am both a Black woman and a Nanakoke woman. I belong to a living tribal community. So I am not just a Black woman who has Native American ancestry. I am Nanakoke and I am Black. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Nanakoke tribe and the history that they have had to fight to maintain their Native American identity and their sovereignty as a tribe. These racial categories, as you'll see, are not fixed, and they're often driven by these different political motives. So the first half of my presentation, I'll be talking a little bit about the historical tracings of racial identity, particularly as they refer to the Nanakoke tribe. There are many other communities that may have some overlapping experiences and some that are entirely different. So today I'm going to give you just a brief snapshot of this history. And then later I'm going to be talking a little bit more about my own personal experience. So in 1705, we have the definition of a mulatto in Virginia being defined as the child of an Indian and the child, grandchild, or great-grandchild of a Negro, and they'll be taken as a mulatto. And so we often consider commonly that mulatto, a term that we don't use today, but one that was used commonly in this time period, as referring to only those who are mixed with Black and white ancestry. However, we can also see that mulatto was a term that was also used to describe people who had Indian or Native American ancestry and Black mixed ancestry. Also commonly, it was also a term that got used to describe people who had mixed white and Indian ancestry, particularly if that person had brown skin. And so we can see that we can already start to see how this, how this word and how these different identifications of race, start to be, complicated. And so we have the census categories as a way in which the government is keeping track of racial identities. And so here I've listed for comparison some examples of the racial categories present in the 1880 census, as well as in the 1930 census. And please know that these are not all the categories that are available at these times. I am just highlighting the ones that are going to be relevant to this presentation. So in 1880, you could also identify as white and Chinese. And then in 1930, there were several different categories as well that got added. But the important thing that I want to note here is that in 1880, the categories for Black and Mulatto are separate, and then there's a separate category for Indian. Whereas when we get to 1930, you have just a singular Negro category and an Indian category. And so those people who were considered mulatto on the 1880 census and are now being classified as Negro in 1930. So as we can see, there are, these racial categories shift. And so the people throughout time will be classified as something different. So Indian people who were living in Delaware were often classified as mulatto, recognizing, based on the government recognizing that they were no longer a military threat and they weren't in the same situation politically and socially as many of the tribal nations out west that the US government was still actively engaging with, either in battles or treaties at this point. So you have many Nanakoke people who are generally considered to be mulatto or colored or some other ambiguous non-white racial term during this time period. And so the Nanakoke Indian tribe mainly would keep to themselves in their own communities, but in the 1880s, they decided that they wanted to set up their own schools to educate their children. So after the Civil War, you have segregated school districts and you have schools for white children and schools for Black children. And these schools for the Black children were underfunded and very underserved at this time. And so for the Nanakoke families, they saw an opportunity to create a separate space for their own children in the hopes that they could give their children a better education, knowing that they would not be able to place them in the white schools, but also hoping to have better opportunities for their children to get a higher quality of schooling than they were going to receive in these Black schools. And so they worked together to create an incorporated body to create their own schools. And so they're listed here in 1881 as, where this arrow points, as a certain class of colored persons. And so you have here that they are recognizing that these are, a particular class. It doesn't specifically say Indian at this time. However, it will, it was recognizing that these individuals, they're not white, they're not Black, but they're a certain class of colored people. And so this is an image of that school and that was created, and it actually still stands today. And today it is the Nanakoke Indian Tribal Center. It's a center for all of our tribal activities. And actually, as of November 15th, it was given a historical marker to note that it was this school, this historical place and very important place for the Nanakoke people. And so in 1903, there is a new statute that's been created to better identify these Nanakoke people that are still living in Delaware. And so now we have this class of people, and now they're being labeled specifically as the descendants of Nanakoke Indians, are able to get a certificate from the state to prove that they are, these Nanakoke Indians, these descendants of Nanakoke Indians. And so they are, further separating themselves as being both a non-white population and a non-Black population in the state of Delaware. And then we have Pleco, who comes in and is a white supremacist and who helps to pass these different laws in Virginia that get applied in other states, including Delaware. And so starting to redefine what these categories mean. And so now we have both colored people or Black people at this time being determined as having, if anyone has any drop of Black blood, they are considered Black. Prior to this, it was anyone having 1/16th and Black ancestry would be considered Black. Pleco worked to change that to say anyone having any type of trace of Black ancestry would then be considered Black. And there's also a code for Indian blood, and they have noted that if anyone has 1/16th or more Indian blood, they are also deemed Indian, but they can only be deemed Indian if they do not have any Black blood or any Negro blood at this time. And so it's further trying to separate these identities from each other. And it's also interesting to point out here that there was what they refer to as the Pocahontas exception for, Pleco was very interested in maintaining this alleged purity of the white race. And so, however, in Virginia, there were many wealthy white people in this place who claimed claimed to be descendants of Pocahontas and John Rolfe. And so, and they were proud of that heritage, but they didn't want to sacrifice any of their white privilege. And so an exception was added in that they could have, that they could still be considered white if they had 1/64th or less Indian blood. And so you can see how race is being, these racial categories are being driven by these different political motives and trying to define who is white, who is Black, and who is Indian during this time. And so in Delaware, we have another racial category sort of being applied to Nanakoke and Indian people in the state. And you have this name Moor, which has a lot of different sort of ambiguous origins as to how these people in the community got titled with this name. But you have here in 1935 them recognizing that the people who have been sort of commonly called Moors, you have here that they are now identifying that these Moors are Indians. And so this information is telling you that these categories, because Moor was often considered to be tracing someone to have Black ancestry. And in this case, now we have Indian students who they're identifying that they do have Black ancestry, but they're also identifying that they are Indians and that they are able to have their own separate schools. And so here's a picture of one of the early classes of students from the Nanakoke School. And as you can see, there's sort of a variety of facial features in these children. Some of them have lighter skin, some of them have darker skin. And a lot of the ways in which people thought about what Indians look like at the time are based on these different, Hollywood stereotypes. And so people did not immediately want to recognize these people and the people from these communities as being Indian because they didn't match that phenotype that people commonly thought about. And then on the 1930 census, we have, you can see here, it's a little hard to read, so I'll take you through it. You have right here, you have this racial category, and you have these members of the Nanakoke community writing in IN for Indian. And then you can see it crossed out and replaced with NEG for Negro. And then if you move further to the right, you see these right categories are asking where their place of birth is. And so you have the individuals identifying their tribal identity, that they're Nanakoke tribe, and that also being crossed out and replaced with state of Delaware as being their place of birth. And so during this time period and up until the 1960s, individuals didn't fill out the census for themselves. There were census takers that went around and documented this. And so they would, so you'd have the census takers, they would go into these communities, they would document what the individual said. In this case, they would tell them that they were Indian and they were part of the Nanakoke tribe. However, when it got back to the Bureau and you have the supervisors reviewing these, they ended up editing them and determining that, you know, these individuals could not possibly be Indian or Nanakoke, and so therefore they must be Negro, because that's what the those were the options for the racial categorizations on the census. And so during this same time, you have these federal Indian boarding schools being created all over the country, and they were both in the US and in Canada. And they were based on this idea that Richard Henry Pratt coined, the idea of killing the Indian and saving the man. And so this was another genocidal tactic by the US government to erase the Indian identity from Native people all over the country. Now, how this intersected with the Nanakoke community in Delaware is that it was determined that by the Bureau of Indian Affairs that anyone who went to these Nanakoke schools actually qualified for attendance at Haskell or at any boarding school, Indian boarding school. And so we had several Nanakoke children that went to Haskell in Kansas. However, it's interesting to note that you had Nanakoke children that went to Haskell in, say, the 1940s and the 1950s. However, after the 1970s, when the national classifications for American Indians changed, and we have what we know now today is sort of this federal recognition process and the concept of federally recognized American Indian tribes, Nanakoke people no longer qualified for to attend these schools. And so you could have the same student who attended the Haskell Institute in the 50s wanting to return to get a college degree because it turned into a college in, say, the 1980s, and then they're denied admission because they are not Indian. So you can see how some of these classifications of race and racial identity have have really shifted throughout our history, and continue to be motivated by different political means. So my mom is Nanakoke, and she's from Dover, Delaware, and my dad is a Black man from Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, I personally was raised in Shaker Heights, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cleveland. Now, some of you may be familiar with the name Shaker Heights based on that popular series now, Little Fires Everywhere. And I have to tell you that Shaker Heights is a real place, and it's where I was raised. And it actually, Shaker Heights has a very fascinating history, particularly around race and integration. So it was a community that in the 1950s and 60s actually chose to create a systematic plan to integrate their schools and their communities. Now, this was mainly in, they mainly targeted white families and asked them to not leave when Black families moved into the neighborhood, to create a sort of equal racial demographic of the community. And today, in this same community and in the school systems, they actively work to address race, and they ask their students to actively have discussions about race and racial identities and discrimination. And so, at the same time, though, discrimination still exists within this community and within the school system. And so in Shaker and in Cleveland, this black and white binary identity is very strong. And a Native American identity is pretty invisible in this city. And so that's based on a couple of different factors. One being Cleveland being home up until very, very recently to the baseball team, the Cleveland Indians, with a very racist mascot. It's just now been changed to the Guardians. However, it still is a very prominent idea and ideas about Native people in that city. There's also a small urban Native American community in Cleveland. However, there isn't a single tribal nation for which people can sort of recognize and organize around. And so um, while while this urban center has definitely spent time over the years to publicly challenge and protest that mascot, for most people in this area, Native Americans are very invisible, and so their only understandings about Native people are through mascots and Hollywood imagery. And so for me, growing up there as a child, I was always identified by everyone else as being Black with something else mixed in. But nobody really knew what that something else was. And sometimes they would ask, and I would tell them that I was both Black and that I was Native American. And, this was very confusing to some people. Mainly, I've had people tell me that they didn't know that Native Americans still existed today. People believe that they were these, that they were in the past. And so it was very confusing to people. And then other people would just assume that I was Black. And so my family always made sure that we knew who we were. And I was very familiar with both sides of my family and some of our family histories. However, when I was very young, I didn't actually realize that my Native identity was the same thing as the Native Americans that were being caricatured and stereotyped in, these mascots and these Hollywood images, because it was so vastly different from what I knew about my own family our and our experiences that I really didn't it did not register with me probably until I was starting to get into my teenage years, where I started to understand some more of these dynamics and understanding that these stereotypes were really meant to dehumanize us and also to erase the contemporary realities of Native people and of people who have mixed race identities. So when I went to college, when I went to Dartmouth College, I was asked in the beginning to check that one box and to decide whether or not I was going to be Black or I was going to be Native American. And I told them that I was both. And I asked them to reflect that. And this was something at the time that they were unable and unwilling to do. And so they ended up not just deciding to mark me as neither, as nothing. And so for me, this was very difficult to connect with some of my Black and Native American classmates. I had to do it all independently because, I got left off of some of um, the scheduled like social activities that freshmen have to introduce them to their classmates and their peers, to have big sibling programs. And so I was able to to meet and join both the Black community at Dartmouth and the Native American community at Dartmouth, and to find my place there as a member of both of these groups. So today, it still continues that people are very confused as to um, me claiming a dual racial identity. Even as today, we are much more open to understanding and seeing and creating more visibility for mixed race people. And people often also ask me, if I'm part something or part this. And for me personally, the way that I see myself as a whole individual, and I am Black all the time, and I am Native American, I am Nanakoke all the time. And both of these are intersecting my identity at all times. So thank you. I look forward to some questions.
Karelle, this was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. My mind is blown because of the information, but also because of your experience. And I feel like this is a conversation and a presentation that we don't usually have the opportunity to hear from. And so, one of the things that I was particularly blown away with when you were presenting the history was when you were talking about how there was that period of time, particularly between 1880 and 1930, where it was okay or it was welcome for Native mulattoes to be considered Native if they were white, but not if they were Black. And then you kind of walk us through that history, even into your present personal experience. And so I'd love for you to just talk a little bit more, because it really sounds like there is both a legislative and a cultural erasure of the Native history of Black people in particular. Not necessarily, not to say that there is not an erasure of Native peoples as a whole, but particularly saying that Black people are not allowed to be a part of the Native narrative.
Yes, absolutely. And, part of this is based in the legislation and the laws. And, part of it is based in the social structure. And the social structure is really being determined by white supremacy, right? And so you have, it's in white supremacy's best interest to create these divides between different people.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so for me, you have like, it's so there's a lot of anti-Blackness that exists in Native American communities, and there's a lot of anti-indigeneity or anti-Native American in Black communities. And some of this gets, and some of this gets fueled um, through popular imagery. Like if we think about like sort of mascots, like you have plenty of people like in Atlanta, for example, they are celebrating, their team's victories. But they are known as the Atlanta Braves, right? And so there is, this tension there between, um, recognizing Native people as recognizing the humanity of Native people. That's really what this mascot debate is about, right?
Right.
It's about the fact that, we are people, and,
Yeah.
we can, and mascots continue to sort of dehumanize us. Um,
Yeah.
but you also have, you know, um, this legacy of anti-Blackness, particularly as that's been sort of fueled by a lot of these government policies against Native Americans, because it is in the government's best interest right now. It's sort of their intention to have fewer Native American people to deal with, right? Like and you can kind of see that in in their sort of history of interaction with Native people. And so there is sort of this legislative erasure of one way to get rid of or to reduce our Native American population is to to claim that anyone who has any kind of Black ancestry, it cannot be considered Native. And so and so for the purposes of survival now, you have Native communities denying, those mixed race individuals as a way to, just a survival tactic to keep their communities alive.
Wow.
And then it sort of develops into these, these ideologies and these feelings that people are having, and these tensions that continue to exist between the communities.
It's so interesting. And the question I'm going to ask you now is, maybe speak a little bit more to the tension that exists between Black and Native communities, because I know for me, growing up Black American, I would always grow up with the narratives of Black people claiming every native tribe that they could potentially think up in their mind, right? So I know even my family would try to claim, oh, hey, my great great grandmother is Cherokee, or my grandmother on my father's side was part Blackfoot. And so you have these very interesting dialogues amongst Black American communities where there seems to be like a very intense desire to be connected to Native communities. And I'm not quite sure where that comes from. Um, because some of the time it's true, and then most of the time it's not. And so where is this tension, where Black communities desperately want to be considered Native, but then also the tension of potentially having negative, or stereotypically negative thoughts towards Native communities?
Yeah, that is a question we could probably have an entire other presentation on, right? But you know, part of this is for Black people in this country, so much of our heritage and identity has been stripped away through this whole legacy of slavery,
Mm,
right? And so um you have people who are searching to put the pieces back together for their own histories and their own ancestries, and really wanting to know what their like what their family trees look like. So that's one part of it. And then you also have the knowledge that the historical interactions between Black communities and Native communities during this whole colonial period
mm,
have been very systematically erased from the history, from the public history records.
yeah,
And so you have this distrust in this narrative brewing that um, that Black and Native people didn't intermingle or didn't interact or didn't intermix, right? And so, I think part of it is this like argument against that narrative,
gotcha.
that I think, that people are really trying to tap into. And then, I think there's also this question of, belonging and American identity. And you can see this as well with white communities and individuals who are claiming Native American ancestry as well, right? This idea of like wanting to ground themselves to this place and connect to this place, to this land that we're on. Um, and so, those are some of the factors kind of driving those stories.
Yeah.
And there are several others. And
Yeah.
and I think that honestly, I know there are some people who are really interested in like researching this particular topic and writing about it and really trying to take a deep dive into, understanding like, what work those oral histories are doing in our communities and our families, because it is a really interesting question. Um, but yeah, but then going back to sort of like, why would they also want to claim something that has this negative, very
Yes.
negative public connotation? And I think this is also based on the ways in which Native people are not only sort of dehumanized, but also exoticized, right? And
Mm,
so you have like a little bit of Native identity actually being a very socially like actually gaining you some social capital, some social status, right? So
gotcha.
if you can have just a tiny bit, a tiny connection, to Native America, then that gives you some level of social prestige and clout. However, if you have
Yeah.
too much, then you're just too much of then you're an Indian, and then that becomes, you that's something that people that most people, like non-native people, don't want to be. And so, it's just kind of
Mm.
interesting thinking about like, how people are sort of structuring their identities based on what the current political and social climates are and how they can sort of, you know, best like orient themselves to it.
Wow. So that's very insightful because as I'm thinking, right, like I've always been, I've taught and I have been taught that, race is a social construction. And so when we then think about um, almost the absurdity of race, I was really wondering during your presentation, is race really absurd when we're having a conversation about the Black and Native experience in America? Because it almost seems like um, the way that race has been constructed here in the States is problematic. However, it feels like Black and Native peoples also need identity markers. So it's like, how is there almost like this tug of war happening, historically when you were talking, particularly between 1930 into the present, where it's like, I actually am trying to document and identify my Native heritage. This identification and this classification is important. It matters to me, but then also potentially puts you now as a later descendant in a situation where you are now being forced to choose an identity marker, and in fact being pressed that if basically what I wrote down when you were sharing your story was they were basically whenever you were pressing as a Black native for dual recognition, then they were classifying you as nothing ethnically, so that the system is only permitting specifically Black people and specifically Black natives to only be one or the other. But I feel like this kind of dual ethnicity, particularly right now in this cultural moment, is very much so celebrated within other racial or ethnic communities.
Yes, absolutely. So I think going back to that first part that you said about this idea of race as a social construct, yeah, it is a social construct, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have real material impacts and, in our existence, in our world. So people talk about like race isn't real. It is a social construct, but it is real because it has real ramifications for how we exist in the world today. And yes, I think that you know, I have certainly seen a lot of progress in recent years for people um, having more opportunities to claim that dual racial identity.
Okay.
Particularly as we think about if we're just looking at, for example, in the census records, how people can, choose multiple categories, and people are also, choosing for themselves. Because like I mentioned at one point in my presentation, like up until the 1960s census, you had, census takers who would just go into, they would go door to door and, record um, what the people told them or what they decided that the people were going to be, right? And so you have, now a little bit more agency for people to be able to, identify themselves, fully.
Yeah, that's amazing. So one of the things, and you didn't present on this, but it crossed my mind, particularly when you were talking about, the potential different experiences that Black Indians and white Indians have had here in the States. I was wondering, do you feel as though there is a color conversation that happens in Black Native or Black and Native communities from the standpoint of um, Black Native Americans or Native Americans in general who are of a darker hue are treated more poorly than Native Americans or Black Native Americans who are of a lighter hue?
Yeah, I mean, colorism is, it's definitely part of these issues in the same way that it is, even just within the Black community, and within the Native community as well, right? Because you know, you have Native American people who are, very fair skinned, who are, who may look white to other people, right? Versus Native Americans with sort of those features that we often sort of publicly associate with Native people, the sort of medium brown skin, the long, straight black hair, particular profiles, like very, that the images that we've had that have been reinforced through these different like Hollywood stereotypes. And
Yeah.
so certainly like, colorism is a big issue. So, when you're looking at a person and you see a person who maybe to you looks Black and they're claiming a Black and Native identity, that person may have, they may face a lot more resistance from other people to being able to claim that versus, somebody who, for me, for example, like I have been told throughout the course of my life that that I look Black, but also they recognize that I'm probably, mixed with something.
You got
As I
something
guess
else in you there, Karelle.
right, and so if, and so when I tell them Native American, they're like, oh, okay, well, we could kind of see that. Like there's a little bit more of an acceptance of me at least being able to claim it as a part of my heritage.
Sure.
Um, than somebody, who would have, darker skin than me.
Yeah.
But also, in my own personal experience, I know that a lot of, um, in Native American communities that I have, walked through, I um, they are more used to seeing Native people who have, lighter skin tones and look more white than they are used to seeing individuals who are darker and also are, have Black ancestry. And so my own experiences, I've seen that the the people who have mixed Native and white ancestry are often more accepted as Native than those who have, Native and Black ancestry. And that's just in my own narrow,
Yeah.
experiences. I'm sure that other people, may have seen this differently. And I do hope that, you know, as more and more people um, are embracing sort of that mixed race identity and being able to proudly proclaim their Black and Native identities, that, that those circumstances will shift.
Absolutely. I mean, we've talked a lot about the dominant culture, but I also was wondering as well, in your personal experience, do you feel like you've been embraced by Native communities?
Well, I have certainly been embraced by my community. Um, and I like, and I do look like a lot of my community. Even though I do, even though my dad's family are Black, right? But I'm also sort of recognized and have been, embraced by my community. Um, as far as other Native communities, I would say it definitely depends a little bit. I have, particularly here on the East Coast, where there are so many communities that have sort of similar histories to the Nanakoke, up and down the Eastern Seaboard. It's a lot easier to sort of move through those circles. They recognize me and they recognize, my identity and my history as being something that's very familiar to them. Um, when I was in college and I was interacting with, Native students from all over the country, I received, and that was also, a while ago as well. And so, I definitely noticed a lot more resistance, from some individuals um, for me, for recognizing me as a fellow Native American. But I was
Yeah.
also embraced by others as well. So, I've seen it, I've seen both.
That's awesome. So this conversation is airing the day before Thanksgiving here in America. And so people are watching this right now, and then they're going to go into what is a typical American feast. And this is oftentimes accompanied with problematic, at least in my estimation, right? Problematic narratives and stereotypes around American history, around the Pilgrims, around why we do this day and what we're even what happened on that day. And so I'd love to kind of give you a second to just respond, share with us a little bit about what your personal opinion, given all the research and understanding that you have, as well as lived experience, um, um, what Native, what Thanksgiving kind of means to, or the impact that it has on you and your family, and particularly the Nanticoke tribe.
Yeah, I mean, Thanksgiving it's one of those real interesting holidays, right? And one of the questions that I think many Native people get asked is, do Native Americans celebrate Thanksgiving? Um, and so I also want to highlight, one interesting thing about the question itself, and this idea that there could possibly be one answer that would encompass all of the views of Native America, right? And so there are many different people, individuals, and communities that have, these different ideas about how to approach this very, difficult holiday. Um, because we do not want to we do not want to celebrate this um, this celebration of manifest destiny of
Right. This history of
of
genocide and
colonial,
trickery and deception.
right, of yes, exactly. Um, but many Native people use it as an opportunity for educating people
Mm.
about the history. Some people use it as a day of mourning to mark everything that has been lost. Others see it as a time to gather with their friends and family and to celebrate the fact that we are still here. And as a time to sort of, you know, celebrate our family and our ongoing sort of resilience. The Nanakoke tribe used to have their annual powwow during the Thanksgiving period as a way to celebrate the fact that, we are still here. And so one way to do that is to, gather with our friends and family to have our private powwows at the time. They didn't become public until the 70s. Um, so it was just a time for families to gather together. Um, and so I think that, many members of my family and my community see this holiday in that light. A lot of us will spend the time to, educate those around us about this sort of false history that gets continued and perpetuated about this holiday. But then for ourselves, this opportunity to really, to be there with family and to recognize the fact that, we are still here and that is something worth celebrating.
Man, Karelle, I have been educated, I have been inspired, I have absolutely loved every moment of your presentation and this conversation. Do you have any final thoughts? If there was a takeaway that you wanted to leave with our audience based on the conversation we've had today, what would it be?
I would say, well, I would thank everyone who is listening to this because to me that signals that you want to know more and you want to learn, and I would encourage you to keep learning and keep challenging some of those things that have been taught to you about our history, and to really go out and to talk to people and to hear their stories and to think about your own biases and where those biases come from. So we're all constantly on this journey of knowledge and self-improvement and looking to learn more about the people around us, and so I encourage you all to just go out and continue to do that.
Man, thank you so much, Karelle. We want to thank all of you for tuning in once again to another virtual Lunch and Learn put on by the Howard County Office of Human Rights and Equity. We are so grateful to you, and we ask that you just continue to follow us on social media at HOCO OHRE. We will continue to put on a variety of virtual as well as in-person dialogues, events, and trainings, and we want you to stay tuned for every single one of them. Of course, as I said in the beginning, if you or someone you know living, playing, worshiping, studying here in Howard County experiences any kind of discrimination, then please remember to reach out to us at OHRE, OHRE at howardcountymd.gov, OHRE at howardcountymd.gov. Thank you all. And from our office to you, please have a great and safe holiday.